do have more people joining as I speak, but I think let's get underway. So, bit of context. At our previous webinar, those of you who were on it, you will recall we were looking at the concept of polycrisis and indeed running a mini exercise on that subject. Clearly, by its very nature, polycrisis means multiple impacts and risks all emerging at once. That seems to be the world that we're operating in at the moment, but almost always the kind of economic situation globally and the geopolitical situation globally is part of that polycrisis. So it seemed really appropriate to run a session specifically on the risks of trade relations in a very volatile and uncertain global economic picture. And I think that's further exacerbated by the fact that the pause on tariffs, the 90-day pause, that is theoretically due to end in July, as we know. Predictability is not the president's number one quality, so I'm interested to hear what Allie's views are around what may happen there, but also for those of you based in the UK, and I think about 3/4 of the people on the line today are based in the UK. The UK government has, in the last 24 hours, published its new trade policy, trade growth policy, and I'm just reading from the start of their press release. It says, the strategy will make the UK the most connected nation in the world, and here's the important bit for the people on this call, while protecting vital industries from global threats. So with that context, I am really delighted to formally welcome Allie Renison to this call. Allie is a true expert in global trade relations. She is a director of SEC Newgate, the international reputation management and communications consultancy. Before that, she worked in UK government, most recently as a policy advisor to the Business and Trade Secretary of State, and of course was involved with the Institute of Directors, working closely with both business and government during one of the last big global, or certainly local, trade issues, Brexit, of course, which seems to have kind of fallen into the past now, but clearly there were significant and continue to be significant impacts coming from that. Allie is a commentator on the media and conference platforms on this topic. So, Allie, thank you very much for joining us. And maybe you'd just like to say a few more words about your background and experience before I start to throw some questions at you.
Sure, hi everyone, thanks for having me. Despite the accent, I am actually technically half British, so I do know a little bit about the UK, and having lived here for about 15 to 20 years, most of my, actually the entirety of my professional career has been here in the UK. I think as sort of Jonathan mentioned, so I was a policy advisor to the last Business and Trade Secretary of State, but very closely in touch with the sort of her successor, Jonathan Reynolds, who's the current sort of Secretary of State. Worked very closely with parliamentarians, sort of businesses who are trying to engage with government, and I think very much that, you know, I was just speaking to someone this morning about the fact that we are now kind of in an era of managed trade, even for trade purists like myself who would rather that not be the case. The reality is that whether it's sort of tracking what the president is doing in Washington, or rather I should say tweeting, posting to his Truth Social, there's a need to really, from a corporate affairs and corporate diplomacy point of view, for businesses to be really closely engaged with what government is doing, because I think the days of just, you know, trading in isolation and not having to worry about government intervention are probably well behind us now.
Thank you. So we've got a wide array of sectors represented. I've jotted some of them down. We've got financial services, drinks, travel, professional services, aviation, technology, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and so it goes on. So this is clearly a topic which is of real interest and impact right across those sectors. And by the way, for those of you joining us, please do begin to post any questions you may have. I've got a whole handful that I'm going to put to Ali, but at the end of the session, we will take questions from the audience via the question or chat box. But let me start with a very general one, Ali. So what is your overall assessment of the current global trade relations landscape? Where are we, and what do you see coming over the coming weeks, months, to the end of this year?
Well, I think it's a sort of double-edged sword at the moment. It was interesting. We had in our offices 2 weeks ago the head of the World Trade Organization, the Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and she was making the point that actually that the way in which trade relations and objectives that the U.S. have to try and force other countries to lower their trade barriers is far from ideal. So we are in a world where there's a lot of unilateral action being taken. But it was interesting, and I very much concur with her assessment in that kind of event that we had, that effectively it's not the time to waste, a bad crisis, but don't lose the opportunity. And what I mean by that is that we're, for all of, I think, Trump's unilateral approach on tariffs, he is very much a deal maker. And so I think we're going to be having, at least for the next 4 years, I don't think it's going to calm down particularly. There's going to be a lot of intensified trade talks between countries, not only between the US and other countries who are hoping to kind of absolve themselves of the worst impact of Trump's unilateral tariff actions, but also with each other. So we're seeing a real kind of spike now in activity in terms of trade relations between countries who are looking to do more trade with each other to try and potentially offset what is happening with the US. It was interesting to see that, Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor here in the UK, and now the sort of Premier of Canada, Prime Minister of Canada, was very keen to restart trade talks with the UK. And I chuckled a little bit when I saw that, because during Brexit, when he was the Bank of England governor, Mark Carney was quite dismissive of the idea that, the UK should be reprioritizing or additionally prioritizing engaging with Canada rather than the EU. So now I think countries are very much desperate to sort of try and diversify their trade talks with each other. So that means ultimately that there are, from a lot of this back and forth between countries, yes, there's the potential for retaliation and trade defense issues, but there's also quite a lot of opportunity for liberalizing it as well.
Excellent. And so that clearly, at a kind of macro level, those new agreements provide real opportunities. Do you see, and we're going to talk about risk as well, clearly many of the people on this call are responsible for risk within their organizations, but let's look on the bright side for now. Do you see any other opportunities for individual businesses in the current trade relations landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I interestingly think one of the potential opportunities, I don't know if I could go as strongly as to say it's an opportunity, but one of the things that I've noticed that not only the UK government is doing, but other countries are doing, is because obviously on the one hand, you cannot control kind of bilateral trade relations in terms of policy outcomes. It's ultimately a negotiation with other countries, whether it's the US or other governments. But what you can control is your domestic policy approach. And I think that the uncertainty of trade headwinds that is happening currently has provided almost perhaps an excuse for business governments, including the UK, to try and take a more business-friendly approach to some of their domestic policy levers. And we saw that with the industrial, sorry, the light's just gone off. We saw that with the industrial strategy last week. It was interesting. It was explicitly mentioned that manufacturing industries were going to get exemptions from renewable energy obligations. So I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that governments are responding to uncertain things outside of their control internationally, trying to be a little bit more business friendly where they can, and very much focusing on the manufacturing industries, because there's also, I think, a race to kind of control the he who has the chips wins, basically. So that the race for AI kind of dominance means that a lot of countries are doing huge amounts of investment in their kind of manufacturing and foundational industries. But also here in the UK, that has been expanded to include the professional business services sector, the creative sectors. There were a whole host of I mentioned in the industrial strategy. So I think that governments are using the uncertainty to sort of be a little bit more business friendly, not always, but in some certain sectors, to try and make that part of their industrial policy.
And tell me if this is unfair at this stage, but do you have any quick insights out of the recently announced trade growth strategy?
Yeah, so it was literally published at 9:15 this morning. Actually, I should say it was late. It was due to be published at 9:15 this morning. It was done at 10. I've just come off a call with the Business and Trade Department, sort of Trade Director General, where we talked through some of these provisions. It is a 100-page document. It's pretty well summarized, some of the big things in the executive summary. And I think for me, as someone who worked in that department until a year ago, the biggest takeaway, and I'll go through a couple of others, is I think the department is no longer using free trade deals as a sort of baseline metric to measure success on trade. I think that was a very post-Brexit kind of phenomenon with the last few Conservative government iterations. And so they're really targeting now specific sectors that are aligned to the industrial strategy, and I think trying to particularly focus, for example, on leveraging, let's say in the services sector, there hasn't always been as much of a focus on regulatory cooperation. There's a fund for new regulator to regulator kind of discussions to discuss for services trade. There's an interesting focus on border modernization to try and get this, you know, you have different agencies at the border, so they're trying to get a little bit more streamlined together so that businesses only have to input the data once. And there's also, I think, and that's in line with other parts of the world, there's a subtrailing of the toughening of trade defense tools. So I think that, you know, in the world that we live in now, where trade is no longer really seen as an unalloyed good in and of itself, but more as a sort of means to an industrial policy end, they're very much looking at trying to build trade defense tools to act as deterrents so that other countries don't take unfair sort of trade decisions against the UK. Big question about whether that work, but I definitely consider giving it a read. It's even though it's 100 pages, it's not all 100 pages of fluff, believe me.
Excellent. So clearly that is literally a breaking development. How would you suggest businesses on this call should kind of scan for the future, horizon scanning? Again, sadly, maybe particularly coming from a risk perspective, how can people make sure that they are forewarned of what's coming down the track and therefore begin to prepare for the risks that may bring?
I think there's probably, I can hear a little bit of an echo, sorry. I think there's probably more than one way of looking at that. My instinct that works with sort of in terms of government engagement is, you know, if you look at, for example, there's the proactive piece that government is doing. So, for example, you know, the legislative intent is clear in terms of what the government wants to do. You know, you can go back and read the King's speech for some of that. But in terms of some of the more reactive things to kind of watch out for, you know, the next big inflection point, as I think you mentioned, is going to be July, around the July 9th, when they do this sort of potential increase in sort of tariffs. Really making sure that your what I call corporate diplomacy and sort of making sure that all ends of the business are covered. You know, you'd be surprised. It takes me back to the Brexit days of it's not always just about, for example, sourcing strategies. It's about where is the direction of travel on, you know, on regulation, but also on contracts. You know, we had a lot of discussions during the Brexit years about, you know, was Brexit an example of a force majeure? Similar, are tariff sort of changes, is that an example of sort of force majeure? Can you actually, should you be expecting, you know, companies with whom you kind of supply to sort of suddenly try and declare that and change it? So I think it's sort of preemptive sort of action there in that space. But also, if you look at, so for example, really what I would call supply chain mapping. I'm always surprised by the amount of businesses who may not directly deal in goods, but, you know, they're in a value chain with goods. And similarly to Brexit, really trying to do a thorough supply and value chain analysis of seeing where the pinch points of where things might get passed down the line to you are, because I think it's caught businesses out by surprise who haven't really fully mapped that out.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure, again, for many people on this call who are responsible for resilience, that's very much going to be on their minds at the moment. And I would absolutely endorse your suggestion and, yeah, encourage people to do that scenario planning. Sadly, over the last few years, we've seen that bad things of many different kinds and flavors can happen. And so just walking through and identifying what those risks are and what the contingencies might be should they emerge, I think is so important at the moment, when I do think the world is even more unpredictable now than it has been for decades. So yeah, think it through before it happens, to at least give yourself a chance of getting ahead of it. Ali, you talked about engaging with government. What's the most effective way of doing that?
I think it depends on the sector that you're in. It's also, in the same vein as understanding, the whole, I'm sure people do understand the whole parts of their business, but sometimes I find that companies don't always know that, let's say that you're in the, you may be exposed to international trade, so you go to the trade department, but actually sometimes it's HMRC that you have to sort of be aware of. For example, HMRC are, together with HMT, are trailing a new consultation, for example, that is going to be looking at low value kind of imports. And this is similar to what we have in the States, which is de minimis relief. Basically, anything under a set amount that you import doesn't have to be dealt with by tariffs. You don't have to pay tariffs. And even if your business is not importing goods, that sit below that threshold, there is the serious potential for, if that consultation in any way mimics what the U.S. is doing, this is all in the vein of economic security, that's a reverberation that logistics is going to pass on cost to you if you are involved in any kind of way that touches some of those businesses. So I think it's about, when you map out your value and supply chain, it's also identifying which parts of government are actually most important for the business. It's not always just the home department. I found that a lot with sort of agribusinesses, for example. So, making sure that you understand how different parts of government correspond to what you're doing. Now, obviously, there are trade associations that are quite helpful for sort of flagging some of that. I think that what we're seeing is a lot more companies are employing kind of sort of consultancies to try and do that horizon scanning for them, because obviously the smaller the company is, the harder it is to have someone do that on top of their day job. And so that's where sort of I think some of the professionals who come in who are really quite good at sort of doing the sort of crisis anticipation, basically not just being reactive and looking proactively at kind of what are the regulatory risks to your business, and how to sort of navigate government to respond to them before, or rather to get you ahead of the curve.
You mentioned earlier on that in the UK in particular, there is a feeling that government may be a little bit more business friendly, than they have been in the past. Is now a good time to be engaging with government, and do they really listen? Can we influence? Can we change, or at least, as I say, shape their views, if not completely change them?
Yeah, so I'm going to caveat it because I'm sure there are some people on this call who think, what on earth is she talking about? I can give you an example where government's not listening. The starkest example of that is probably not going to move away from the increase in national insurance sort of contributions. But what we're seeing is that, particularly I think on the energy side, for businesses who are really being hammered by, high energy costs, is that industrial strategy, particularly if you're in a sector that sort of, let's say, is enabled or facilitates it, is trying to engage with government to make the case for why that should also, let's say, these exemptions sort of extend to you. We've seen, for example, on a really specific issue on the zero emissions vehicle mandate, that was also slightly relaxed as a sort of a pre-look ahead to the industrial strategy about 2 months ago. And so I think that what government is interested in is, and it's not just government, it's also engaging with, let's say, in this case, because of where we are currently, let's say backbench Labour MPs, who are quite able, they are in a kind of, search for growth. There's a Labour growth group, and they really want ideas for how we can unlock some of the investment that government is desperately chasing but can't actually finance itself. So one of the things I always say to businesses in terms of engaging with government is, don't just go with a problem. A, go with an identified solution, but B, also reinforce that with kind of ideas that you have for wider economic growth. It was fascinating to me to see that the number 10 were asking economic regulators for their idea on growth, which you wouldn't always associate with regulators. But it's always good to try and contextualize the asks and solutions that you have on a specific policy issue with ideas about how what government can do to help contribute towards, for that sector, their economic growth agenda. And the last thing I would say on that is, particularly talking to this government, I always say this to clients, it's really important to try and frame the asks and objectives that you have in terms of the mission. So Labour had kind of 5 missions, and there's bits that sit below that. So if you can kind of frame the ask as this is how this will help contribute to delivering their various missions, then you're going to have a little bit more of a receptive audience. So yeah, tune into their agenda and show how you can be kind of partners in helping to achieve the framing. You can always be clever with the framing and messaging. Brilliant. Let's talk about risks a little bit more. As I say, sadly, many of the people on this call are always looking for the worst case scenarios rather than the best. Obviously, there will be some trade risks which are very sector specific, but for you, what are the, let's say, top 3 or 4 trade relations risks that you think organizations should be particularly focused on, particularly aware of, and making plans to make sure that they are ready to respond should they escalate? Sure. I mean, I think for me, the one that keeps jumping out at me and I keep hearing about is unexpected sort of requests passed down the sort of supply chain around kind of, pricing. This is why you have to have a pretty proactive and reactive pricing strategy. So suddenly sort of, it may not even be, directly between sort of suppliers and customers. It may come down further down the line. So I think anticipating where pricing sort of ordering requests may change is probably sort of in terms of the impact on tariffs. And then I think also in terms of kind of from the trade piece is the impact that's going to have on inflation potentially. It's a little bit less tangible, but I think one of the things that's relevant for all businesses is that, market confidence gets translated into economic data ultimately at the end of the day. Yeah. So, being aware of that, but also from a communications perspective, I've noticed that, the way in which companies engage with trade uncertainty really matters. That, and I'm going to talk about this both in a risk and an opportunity sort of sense, is that, I think customers really kind of value transparency. Now, there's a risk in being overly transparent, as we saw in Washington a couple of weeks ago when it was reported that Amazon was going to put how much of the price next to their item was derived from, the tariff increase, and they were called a hostile actor by the White House. So you have to be a little bit careful with how transparent you want to be. But I really think that, we are now in a sort of situation where customers, whether it's B2B or B2C, really kind of value transparency and communication from companies, from the people that they sort of are supplying from or supplying to about any potential sort of changes. And really, ultimately, I think that we're now in an environment where will people be shopping around, so to speak? Maybe, but actually, if you're clear with your communications, rather than just, you will have, I think, quality right now and is key to sort of customer retention. I think people really want to stick with businesses who are not threatening about what they want to do, but explaining what they might have to and sort of saying this is how we're still going to try and work around it so we don't actually have to pass the costs on. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think stakeholders of all kinds recognize the economic environment in which we are all operating now. So the kinds of messages that you were talking about, I don't think would be unexpected. What is really unhelpful, as you've said, is a lack of communication. And clearly one of the first rules of crisis communication is to shape the narrative, get ahead of the situation, and maintain the trust and confidence of your stakeholders. None more so than your own people, but certainly your customers. So yeah, I would also be advising organizations to do their scenario planning, but specifically identify who are those critical partners that could be impacted by
negative trade risks, and who are they? How would we communicate with them? What would we say to them? And when that moment comes, don't be slow in coming forward. Much better they hear it from you than hear it from a third party or a competitor's stealing a march on you.
The only thing I want to flag, just to follow up the kind of sort of fully answer the question on sort of trade risk, because one of the things that we've definitely noticed in the sort of trade policy community is that enforcement is starting to really matter, and that starts with Washington. So I think I mentioned it here that, you know, de minimis, which is really supposed to be kind of the idea behind it is that you know, over or under a certain amount, it's not worth counting the tariffs, because you spend more doing that as a government than you do you know, collecting it. But we are increasingly seeing that these trade facilitations are being considered to being exploited, and so the U.S. and other countries are starting to come down hard on what they see, what are legitimately used by legitimate traders as trade facilitations, the way in which you classify your goods or your origin. I think the enforcement on that, starting with Washington, is going to become a lot tighter.
Right. Okay. I'll move on to a related but slightly different topic. Something we talked about with guests on the previous session was ESG, and the, again, opportunities and risks associated with ESG. To what extent are expectations around ESG requirements shaping global trade policies and practices?
So, I mean, I think I'd look at this in two different ways. A, from the investment community, which is slightly different, and B, from, let's say, kind of from a supply chain perspective. And so, you know, I would say that despite the noise from a supply chain perspective, there is still a lot of desire, organic desire from companies to comply and be seen to comply with their ESG requirements. No matter what Trump is saying about it, doesn't matter. That's a comms issue, and I think that's affecting the investment community a little bit differently. You know, we heard, I think it was BlackRock saying they're not going to talk about you know, ESG work anymore. It's more transition. But I think because coming back to that customer point, you know, ESG compliance and communicating that that's something in your supply chains on ethical sourcing, on supplier audits, on transparency, you know, that not only, I think, helps companies still mitigate risks associated with, you know, changing environmental and social regulatory landscapes, but also I think it's still a key part of kind of communications, and that's what customers kind of still want to see. I mean, we're also seeing it's a little bit of a patchy landscape at the moment from a regulatory perspective. If you look at, you know, the EU, and I'll come to the UK in a minute, you know, the EU has sort of was a big champion of kind of a really kind of enforced ESG regulatory compliance, and then has started to kind of roll a little bit of that back in terms of the extent of it. I look at something like, for example, which you could kind of, I think, fit under the ESG bucket. So two things. One, the EU's deforestation regulation, which has basically been put on hold because of the developing countries' unhappiness with it. They see it as discriminatory. And two, with things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to try and capture and tax effectively the sort of trade in certain commodities that have high carbon emissions. You know, that is now coming under huge kind of pressure, even in the UK. It hasn't come into effect yet, from the farming community, who don't want to be sort of subject to kind of a fertilizer tax for their inputs, because that increases obviously their cost inputs. So, and the interesting thing about that in terms of the impact on trade is that we're starting to see, in terms of the risk register, is that certain countries from whom a lot of these things that are in scope for sort of ESG regulations, they're now seeing them as trade barriers, and they want to retaliate. So India, for example, last week said that if the UK and EU CBAM goes ahead, that they are going to retaliate. We don't know, it might be in terms of retaliatory tariffs, it might be sort of regulatory issues. Interestingly, obviously, we just effectively finalized a trade deal with India. They wanted to get CBAM into that as an exemption. We didn't give that to them. So, you know, it's interesting that we just signed or finalizing an FTA, and we may still be subject to retaliation elsewhere. So it is becoming, in its own way, a trade barrier issue as the regulations advance. But I think, for the most part, from a company compliance and sort of communication to customers perspective, it's still something very much that we're seeing as a reflection of risk management, supply chain resilience, and brand enhancement.
Okay, we talked right at the beginning about Brexit, which, as I say, seems like decades ago now. So much has happened. What's your take on the latest in kind of UK-EU trade relations and the relationship, perhaps even more broadly than that?
So, I mean, we still, I think, suffer in this country from kind of, politically at least, dividing trade into kind of good and bad trade in terms of the regions. And I think that the EU seems to just be forever in this. You either think that it's great to trade with the EU or you don't, politically. So we've seen, for example, the outline framework, and this was Labour's sort of big objective before the election, was that they were going to reset relations with the EU. They didn't want to be constantly fighting with Brussels. However, I think there is a risk that, we've heard with the outline framework deal, because part of it commits the UK to aligning with EU rules on agriculture, and that includes things like crop protection, which I think some of the farming community here is concerned about. You've seen the political opposition on the right, Reform, the Conservative Party, have said they're going to basically junk the deal, if they get into power. So there's, I think there's a lot of cautious optimism about this reset, with a sort of slightly horizon scanning view of, are we going to have to change things again in 4 years? For example, we had to erect border inspection posts because we had such a terrible deal in agriculture, because the EU didn't want to move and we weren't willing to follow any rules, and that's how the EU sort of tends to try and grant market access. It wants other countries to follow its rule, give them market access to their area. And so, there's a lot of hope for, particularly on energy as well. We're going to link our emissions trading systems and schemes. That may take about 2 years. I think that hopefully is not something, unlike agriculture, where you may see people really wanting to unwind it across the piece. I think, and I'm hopeful, that the integration or reintegration of energy sort of systems, and potentially as far as our electricity kind of systems, would facilitate, for example, the interconnectors under the North Sea that connect, everything from Ireland to sort of Northern Europe. I think there's a big opportunity there, and the way that I speak to government about it is, it's really important to try and frame that part of the reset as problem solving, because whether it's because of what's happening in Ukraine, the impact on energy prices, trying to sort of jointly reduce the cost of delivering renewable energy, that's one of the biggest actually wins of what we're trying to do on energy cooperation. It really needs to be solved, presented through a problem solving lens. But my fear is that, you've got just the way in which parts of the political system look at the EU as something as a we don't want to have to trade with them if that's what they ask us to do in exchange for it, in terms of following their rules. I do worry about the longevity of some of what the government's trying to do.
Yeah, and building on that, I mean, it seems to me, and probably many people on this call, that things are now more volatile, unpredictable, uncertain than ever. You've been involved in the world of trade relations for a number of years now. Is that true, or does it always feel like this?
Well, trade is certainly back in business again, for better or for worse. It keeps people like me busy, but that's usually because things are a little bit chaotic. Whenever I have to spend a lot of time on the media talking about what's going on in the trade world, it's not usually for a good reason. But I think, interestingly, one of the things I find interesting about what Trump is doing, and time will tell, is he's going about it, as I said earlier, in a very chaotic way to try and extract kind of concessions. But whereas I think parts of his administration and Washington genuinely want to, let's say, force companies to divest from and decouple from China and even other parts of the Asian market, I think Trump is so much more of a deal maker. Yes, he wants to collect a certain baseline revenue in tariffs because he likes them, but I honestly think that Trump likes tariffs most of all because he can use them to extract deals. And so we may be in a position in 12 months' time, we may still, there may be pauses and further extensions to negotiations, but what he really wants to present, particularly with the midterms in Congress happening next year, and Republicans want to show that this chaotic trade strategy, which has mostly delivered only uncertainty and kind of hits to the economic financial markets, he wants to be able to show that he's achieved something off the back of it that made it all worthwhile, whether it's saying that we've had new investment, some of it's repackaged investment being presented as a new deals, but particularly he wants to show that he managed to get countries to the negotiating table and there was an agreement secured. So in a way, it's a very crude way of interpreting what he's doing, but effectively he is accelerating trade talks like never before. So we may be in a situation as subject to change that is, and I know business wants kind of certainty either way, whether it's sort of, bad arrangements or good, they just want it sort of to be a little bit stable. We may be in a situation in 12 to 18 months time where, there are deals that have been secured and there's a little bit less madness in the market. Yeah,
no, it's a great insight. I mean, clearly he is a man who loves the deal. We've seen over the last 24, 48 hours how upset he was when it appeared that a deal that he had brokered was starting to fall apart. So that clearly is a big motivator to be seen as the person who can do that kind of deal. So moving on to maybe specifically crisis planning, and I'm very much happy to chip in here, Ali, but how can businesses in crisis management terms plan and prepare for volatility, uncertainty as it relates to the trade landscape?
So I'll identify some of the areas, but very happy for you to kind of chip in terms of what to sort of areas of crisis to sort of prepare for. We've talked a little bit about kind of identifying all the extent of the vulnerabilities in the supply chain, developing alternative sourcing strategies, diversifying suppliers, building in sort of any redundancy to ensure continuity of operations, and then there's a monitoring of all the sort of change in trade policies, tariffs, regulations, and strategies to adapt to kind of new rules, and really kind of to explore new markets. I'm hoping that will encourage people to look at diversifying. And then there's, even things like, retaliation can take many forms. And so I think, there's always an incentive to be investing in kind of protecting yourself against cybersecurity threats from rogue nations, shall we say, who aren't happy about what Trump is doing, but also protecting sensitive data and systems from cyber attacks that could disrupt trade operations, compromise IP. Financial contingency plans to address potential cash flow shortages, managing currency fluctuations, hedging was something we saw a lot of companies doing during Brexit, and looking at your kind of range of access to finance sort of options. And then also the last thing I would say is in terms of, this business continuity planning, but also the, crisis communications and having, I think, clear communication protocols for having to react to, even if they're not imminently public ones, but certainly crises that could become quite an issue, whether it's in your supply chain and disruption, protocols for internal and external stakeholders, and how to engage with government. So that's a quick canter through some of the areas that we've been talking about to companies, but I'll pass over to you, Jonathan.
No, absolutely. And I think all of that is clearly extremely well-founded and extremely well worth doing. I've got just 2 or 3 things maybe to add to that. I think if we accept that the world is a more uncertain, volatile and unpredictable place at the moment, I'd be encouraging organisations on this call to increase the frequency of their risk assessment. So, an annual risk assessment probably is not sufficient. I think right now, as things remain volatile, uncertain, probably a quarterly risk assessment is in order if you want to be on top of the changing landscape and ready to respond to it. As people on this call will know, we're not big fans at Insignia of a pure playbook approach to crisis management plans. A good crisis management plan should provide you a way of working, whatever the crisis is. But I do think at the moment, we touched on the value of scenario planning as it relates to potential trade issues. I think that is of value. And I think having some checklists against some of your critical trade and supply chain risks would be helpful and would be advisable. I do again, endorse the idea of planning ahead, who you would need to communicate with, who are the critical stakeholders, how would that happen? And again, to your point, Ali, about it's the polycrisis thing again. Sometimes a trade-related crisis could also have a cyber-related element to it. So think about how you would communicate with your customers and people in the event that you don't have your normal email facilities available to you. I would suggest having the right experts lined up ahead of time so that you're getting good quality advice of all kinds, because this is a specialist area, and having the best or the right experts in place, I think, is really important. And you know, one of the things you talked about, opportunities, Annie, one of the opportunities that we have at the moment is because there is so much going on and we're having regular skirmishes, I would really be encouraging organisations to, when the skirmish is over, whatever it may be, to properly sit down, review what happened, how did we react to it, what could we have done better, what did we do really well, learn, and then act on the learnings, because again, the uncertainty is not going to end anytime soon. So at least learn from and act on experience. Anything you wanted to pick up additionally to that, Ali, or have we covered that off, do you think?
No, I think I'm definitely sort of the review piece is quite important, you know. Probably the only other things I might add is, you know, we don't see necessarily companies, particularly bigger ones, that are absolutely sort of yanking and uprooting their supply chains and moving them entirely. But what I think companies are and should be doing, you know, is, I always call diversification an and, not an or, is, you know, sometimes looking at, I wouldn't even say alternative kind of suppliers to what you kind of already depend on, because I think there's something to be said for trusted relationships, you know, seeing you through, particularly when you have clear communication with them. But I always am a fan of like diversifying to effectively see what some of the additional opportunities are, and it may be actually, you know, an and an addition to your business, not necessarily just an or. Yeah.
You touched on this area earlier on. I think in many ways, trade associations and trade bodies were almost losing their influence over the last 10 or 20 years and being seen as less important. Do you feel that that influence is growing now, and what role can they play, and what considerations should individual businesses kind of bear in mind when deciding whether to kind of front up themselves or put themselves underneath the umbrella of the trade association when it comes to engaging with government?
That's a great question, and obviously I've seen it from the perspective of having worked in a trade association and then working in government with trade associations, with individual businesses, and then now kind of working effectively with individual companies to engage with government. And I'll go through this sort of maybe pros and cons, if that's sort of there. I think from a trade association perspective, particularly this government, you know, does like to speak to trade associations a lot. I think in the last government, sometimes there was probably a sort of an over focus, particularly on big businesses, not just big, but the businesses, and sort of seeing trade associations sometimes as sort of lowest common denominator approach. Having said that, I think what trade associations are really good at doing is, in terms of taking that collective temperature, is they're able to do policy prescriptions when they bring an issue to government's door. I think bigger businesses aren't always as good as coming to government and you know, they'll say this is the issue, but sometimes they don't always know what the policy change is. That's sometimes why they have consultants sort of such as ourselves to help them kind of translate that. Trade associations do that, but I think one of the challenges for trade associations is they can't really be seen to be really lobbying for any particular individual business within the membership. They have to take that sort of collective view rather than going specific, and that's where the benefit of one-to-one engagement between a business and the government can actually help. I think the trade associations are probably good at, particularly for not only but also sort of the SME sort of side of things, because sometimes it's a bit difficult, if you don't know your way around government as an SME, to engage with government and how to frame it, because I think government is sometimes used to or predisposed to talking to businesses that are going to bring huge amounts of kind of a big investment potential to the UK economy. So for SMEs, unless you have someone who knows how to kind of get your issue into government, sometimes the trade association route can be a bit of a more sort of safer route, as it were.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, and if there are others, please send them through, please. We've got about 10 minutes or so left within the webinar. So question here, how should boards and executive teams think about long-term shifts in global trade, especially amid protectionist trends?
Can you, it just fell out at the end there. Repeat that, sorry.
How should boards and executive teams, so very much focusing on the leadership level, think about long-term shifts in global trade, especially amid protectionist trends?
It's a great question, and I think that's what I mean by some of the. If you look at it from a sort of senior management perspective or from a board perspective, which has to think about the long term, you're looking at where the trends are actually going. And I think for me, you can do the day-to-day stuff about what has Trump posted today effectively on Truth Social, or who's getting the extension or who's not on kind of some of the tariffs. But really it's looking at where the long-term trends are going. The long-term trends for me are whether you get a Democratic, for example, president after President Trump, there are certain trends that are consolidating, we are now, as I mentioned earlier, in an era of managed trade. It's not going to go back to kind of, really free market trade or free trade as you might have sort of seen it before. So I think it's important to kind of position businesses as thinking about, from a trade perspective, not just how do you react to kind of external shocks, but also how am I communicating in terms of my engagement with government about what I see trade as being important from a policy perspective. So, I think governments increasingly want to see trade being used to deliver certain advancements. So, for example, I spoke to a business the other day who said, we have communicated to government that the reason that we need to have more open trade still is that this will help our own supply chain resilience. We are diversifying, but we need to make sure that open sort of trade is still a priority. So for me, that's about really looking at where the long-term trends are going. Another long-term trend is ultimately, as part of this economic security or economic nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is, governments really, I think, are prioritizing kind of, investments in certain sectors that are going to continue being priorities. The industrial strategy, for example, in the UK, it's not that other sectors aren't important, but they really are going to prioritize those for the next sort of 10 plus kind of years. And so figuring out if you're not in, if you are in those sectors, and what are your investment plans, how are you kind of communicating that to government as part of, either part of that sector or the supply chain of that sector, is looking at, which direction the wind is blowing long term, and then trying to sort of fit within a framework of that in terms of how you engage with government. But again, lastly, I would say, boards have to consider how you integrate trade into your strategic risk frameworks, considering how trade policy and geopolitical shifts and technological advancements impact their business, and not just from a risk perspective. I think one of the fascinating things that I've seen in terms of how businesses are responding to tariffs is the use of AI-powered platform to do basically trade facilitation efficiencies within their supply chain. So not every crisis produce only risk. Sometimes it can produce opportunities as well.
Absolutely. And we know that again, I'm looking for the silver linings here, that the fact that boards of directors now are, we perceive and we're experiencing, much more engaged and exercised with risk management. It's an opportunity, again, for the people on this call to get the attention and involvement of the leadership team and the board of directors in the work that they do. I think, again, 20 years ago when I started in this area, it was hard for the head of crisis or the head of risk or the head of resilience to get airtime with the board or the exco. I think dynamics changing.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that, you know, ensuring that, you know, I used to work at the Institute of Directors. We talked a lot about corporate governance, what was the right structure in terms of how you kind of have employees' voice heard. But, you know, ensuring that I think also directors and board members have a stake in long-term success, and, you know, to have a sort of slightly more sustainable and responsible approach to decision making, and, you know, balancing kind of the short-term and long-term goals. I think, you know, we all know this, but boards really kind of shouldn't be sacrificing to react to sort of short-term measures, long-term value for kind of short-term gains. Looking at, you know, the broader impact of, you know, I still strongly believe that despite which way the wind is blowing on kind of certain investment decisions, in terms of sort of ESG from Washington, that I still think that integrating sustainability into corporate governance can really help create long-term value and bring sort of a stronger reputation ultimately with a customer base. And I do think that those long-term trade strategies or long-term strategies should be communicated to shareholders, but also other stakeholders in the business, because it helps them have an ownership in it.
Fantastic. Now, we actually have got to the end of the questions from the audience, and do you know what? I think ending at that point would be rather good, because I feel like we've ended on a high point there, Ali. It's clear that there are risks out there. We talked about the importance of being aware of them through the horizon scanning. We've talked about the importance of influencing, whether that's directly with government or via the trade associations, and we talked about planning, crisis management planning, in case the whole thing just explodes. But I think what you've been really good at doing for us today is also emphasizing the opportunities that come out of the current situation, and it's again something we talk about in terms of crisis more generally. There are opportunities that come out of tough times, and I think, yeah, what you've communicated is that this is certainly one of those occasions. I want to say thank you, Ali. Are there any kind of final parting words before we call this session to a close?
The only thing that I would think that I'd like to say is that this reminds me of the lesson that I tried to communicate during Brexit, which was that we are, you know, very often when businesses have to think about trade policy, it means that they're having to deal with reacting to a negative change scenario. However, the literacy that you can build with trade policy, particularly as in an era of managed trade, means that effectively you can build strength and competitive advantage relative to competitors if you take the time to sort of engage with understanding what's behind and what's driving kind of trade policy in terms of how you think about, you know, your international sort of footprint, as it were. So again, don't take the don't lose the opportunity to use make good from a crisis, as it were, because it can build strengths to your advantage in a positive sense as well, not just a negative reactive sense.
Exactly. Fantastic. So both Ali and I would be happy to continue the conversation. You can see our names hopefully on the screen there. We are both easily findable with a quick Google search and or going into LinkedIn. Everybody on the call will also receive a recording of this session. I just wanted also to remind you that if you want to assess how crisis-proof your organisation is, either go to our website and you will very quickly find the crisis-proof analytical tool. There'll also be a link to that within the follow-up email and indeed via the QR code on this screen. Quick heads up, our annual crisis management conference is now confirmed for the 4th of November. So if you love crisis management content but would like to take it from an online session to in real life session, then that opportunity will arise on the 4th of November. Allie, thank you once again for sharing your depth of experience and insight at a time when, as we've seen, news in this area is breaking all of the time. Really appreciate that, and thank you to everyone who joined us on this call. Thank you for joining us, and I wish everyone a crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks, everyone.